Hey guys, well, it's hard to believe, but we're actually 5 years in on our journey with this car now. Some 35 events, probably 3,000 plus stage miles and 10,000 plus miles overall. So I thought it'd be a good time to do a video on what has worked and what hasn't, and kind of what we've learned along the way as we get this car through these events. We've actually never had a full DNF with the car other than the very first rally we did. The engine blew, but we were still able to actually swap the engine and get it across the line. So I've learned a lot about how to keep these cars going and what to look for in between events to prevent failures that are going to take us out of the competition. And of course, we're doing all this on a budget, right? Because we're just a little guy with a NA Subaru doing backyard stuff to go rallying. So let's get this car up in the air and we'll start talking through those changes. All right, first one here, let's talk about exhaust. I see so many rally cars ending rallies without exhausts, which is annoying for you if you lose your exhaust, but it's also very annoying for the guy behind you that has to try and run over or avoid a full exhaust system laying in the middle of a stage around a sudden corner or something like that. So how can you prevent losing components, large components, or the entire thing off the car? So the first thing to accept is the exhaust bolts at the flanges are going to loosen up. It's gonna happen. I cannot count the number of times that I've loosened a bolt or I've lost the bolts from a flange completely, and it's just hanging there in space, the gasket's fallen out. But what saves the exhaust system is having hangers in as many places as possible. So at both ends of each component, having a hanger, so that even if you unbolted every single flange in the exhaust, right, the exhaust can still hold itself up. The components can just sit there on the hangers and rattle back and forth, and of course nothing's sealed, but they're not dropping on the ground and serving as a piece of a pole vaulting equipment or dragging or getting ripped off entirely. So as much as possible, when I put new components in or I adjust things or hammer things out, I'm making sure that everything lines up or fits together with the exhaust just hanging naturally in place on the hangers. And that means I've added hanger locations on this car to accomplish that. Next component, this is something I'm a firm believer in. Have a metal oil pan, just a sheet metal oil pan. I see people running either factory cast aluminum oil pans, or even some of the aftermarket pans, especially for Subarus, are like cast aluminum performance pans, and that's great at a track. But in rally, when you're taking strikes to the underbody, I prefer something that can deform before it cracks and breaks. So this pan in particular, this is an STI oil pan added to the NA to give a little more oil capacity, but I've dented this thing, right? I pushed it in. When my skid plate gets really beat up, that's that's pushing up into the bottom of the oil pan. And obviously there's only so much you can push it before it interferes with the pickup, but just the ability to have that little bit of give without cracking and emptying all your oil onto the ground will save you out on the stages. Next thing to talk about, an oil cooler. So even on my original engine, which was just a bone stock Subaru engine, I added like a $400 oil cooler. It was actually more than the engine was worth at the time. But especially on Subarus, we have oil temperature problems. So a lot of Subaru failures are caused by high oil temps, prolonged RPM, prolonged working of the engine. And this is exacerbated in a stage rally scenario where you don't have much airflow over the car, so you're limited to what the radiator fans are pulling, and it's simply not enough. And even when after 4 years, I put an oil temp gauge in this when I put a new engine in. And so that was the first time I was actually seeing the oil temp measurements, and I was horrified to see that we were hitting like 245 degrees at a relatively cool event, not even one of the hot summer events. and that was with a 7-row Mishimoto. So I've since gone to an even bigger oil cooler, a 21-row C-Trab on this engine, and that may seem like overkill for like a 2.5 engine here, but I'm still hitting, you know, mid 230s, high 230s with oil temp on long stages, which I'm much happier with. But it shows just how much cooling capacity the oil really needs for stage rally conditions. Next item, wheel scrapers. So I have wheel scrapers from a very early point in time on both the front and rear of this car. And just to go over what those are again, is these are essentially consumables. So this is a piece of like UHMW plastic, about 3/16 thick, mounted to a bracket here, and it's angled upwards towards the inside of the car. And the goal of this wheel scraper is to take all of the rocks and dirt that are going to come into your wheelbarrow when you slide sideways on gravel and deflect them, divert them out of the barrel of the wheel before they reach the caliper. So nothing can ever get in between the caliper and the barrel of the wheel and wear either the caliper or the wheel, or get into the brake pads or make issues. The rears, especially here, get chewed up like crazy. I replace these scraper pads every 1 to 2 events if I'm really pushing hard, and if it's you know, something really abrasive, you know, small sharp stones that are going to wear this. So these are treated like total consumables in the rear. The fronts, I think I haven't had to replace them for about 1.5 years now, because they see much less wear. So if you look at the calipers too, these are still the original calipers that I powder coated and put on back in 2019, which is kind of incredible for the mileage that they've seen. And you can see some slight wear at the edges here, but nothing's really done significant damage to this, and nothing's really done significant damage to the wheels. We'll come back to these calipers in a later part of this video and talk about them a little more, because this is another important area of prep. All right, next item is to go over and give your axle boots and your steering rack boots and your ball joint boots, give those boots a visual after every event. And if you see small tears developing, attack them early, because if you get at these, and I like to, I've actually made a repair on this. It's kind of hard to see because it's also in black. But if you get at this with, I use like 3M Marine Adhesive 5200, and I also use like Permatex Black, the ultra flexible stuff. And I clean the area after the end of the event and seal up the small tears. And I go a very, very long time before a boot gets damaged enough to where I have to pull it off and replace it entirely. And I've only ever once at an event had a tear so bad that I had to cover it with like one of those CV savers, or you know, another trick is to cover it with a garbage bag and tape it up or something like that, just to try and save the axle enough to get to the end of the event. So like you can see, even the bellows, the boots on the steering rack, see a lot of dirt and debris. And usually with the axles, you can kind of immediately tell at the end of an event if you had a small tear, because you'll see, you know, the black of the grease getting slung. Even if it's tiny amounts, it gets slung everywhere all around the axle. So I like to keep these areas clean so I can very easily identify when there has been a tear, and then I go out and fix it right away, and I'm good to go. Next item is kind of a common sense thing, but so many people DNF because of this, because they haven't done it fully or at all between events, because they don't want to spend the time doing that. And that is to check every single critical bolt in between events. So just put a wrench or a socket on all your control arm bolts, all your lateral link bolts, your trailing arm bolts, your brake caliper and caliper bracket bolts, and your strut bolts, and make sure that they're not loosening up. So it's hard, especially on the underside, to use a paint pen to mark orientation of stuff like control arm bolts, because it just gets worn away or covered in dirt instantly, and you don't have a good idea of if it's shifted or not. So with things like the strut bolts, we can use that paint pen and even see at services at a rally if things have loosened up. But I cannot count the number of times I've gotten this car on a lift after an event and gone through and it's like, ooh, that critical bolt is loose or starting to back out, or man, I would have lost a brake caliper bolt. And any one of those, if they come loose on the stages, is event ending right there. So tedious but simple thing, and it prevents so much pain when you're out there on the stages. All right, this lesson took me a while to learn, but from the beginning, I should have made rocker sliders. So the rockers on this car, especially being an all-wheel drive car, or if you have a rear-wheel drive car, you're gonna beat the heck out of these rockers. And after some events, I was coming home and it's literally bare metal. From here all the way back, it's totally stripped bare. It's shiny, wonderful bare metal, ready to prime and paint. So what I've added here are just some sliders to target the high wear areas. So if I left this alone, I would eventually wear right through the metal of the rocker with just the abrasiveness of the stone going through this. So these simple, again, this is UHMW plastic, 1/8 inch. These simple covers on this back foot and a half of the rocker are preventing so much work going on in between events to repair damage or to repaint or deal with what the rock has stripped away. All right, last one here, license plate mounting. So most cars are going to have the license plate bolted to the bumper cover in the rear. And that means that as soon as you have an off or an event that tears off the very easy to tear off bumper cover, your license plate is gone too. And you may find it difficult to communicate to officials or state police why you should be allowed to continue the event. So what I've seen done and what I have done is change the mounting of the license plate bracket so that it's mounted to the metal bumper beam behind the bumper cover. So that means if I lose this bumper cover, if I go too wide and I get in the bushes and a bush catches this thing and tears it off, I have a chance of retaining my license plate even though the cover is gone. And then it's a matter of maybe retrieving the bumper cover from a helpful spectator or sweep at the end, rather than a full-on panic of how do I finish this event with no license plates? And am I going to get to the next stage, or am I going to get in trouble? Because people look real close at cars with missing bumpers and no plates. All right, let's get into some don'ts. So this is a simple don't, and this is for the Undertray Plastic, right? That basically follows along with my trailing arms and goes below the lateral lengths in the axle to protect the rear. Don't cinch these zip ties down. Leave them very loose. You can see how much room I've got left in these zip ties, right? And you're gonna need that to allow the plastic to flex independently of the suspension. So you want this thing to be really floppy and droopy in the rear so it can articulate without snapping the zip ties. Because if you snap all these zip ties, then this thing is really gonna be on the ground and then you've got problems. So be mindful of where you need movement in the underbody protection and leave the gap to do so. So here's another one I kind of learned the hard way. When I first built this car, I did not have underbody plastic for the full length of the floor pan. I only had it from here back, which is just for the trailing arms and rear suspension basically. And I beat the heck out of the floor pan. And even worse was I actually caught the harness sub-belt mount bolt that was sticking through the floor with a rock at one event and yanked the whole harness very, very tight in my racing seat, which, as you can imagine, was not a pleasant experience. And I said some bad words and was pretty thrown off for the beginning of that stage. So it was only a couple of years in that I actually decided to go back and mount plastic all the way up. And I didn't want to do this at first because when you terminate this front plastic here, you just have an edge sticking into space kind of. And that means it's very easy to catch that edge on something, a rock or an outcropping, and peel or roll the front of the underbody plastic underneath the car and essentially fold it under itself and cause problems. And indeed, I've had that happen now that I've added this front protection. But I've also, I've heated this up with a torch and I've kind of made a little lip, a ramp, if you will, just like a skid plate on the front of these, so that I don't have quite as much of a chance of just tearing this off. So I really, really wish I had done this from the beginning. It is an absolute pain in the butt to do this, but it is worth it in the long run when you look at what it takes you to repair this floor afterwards otherwise. On a very similar topic, resist putting holes into the cabin as much as possible. This is something I wasn't really cognizant of early on, because it doesn't matter if you're building a car for the track or anything else, right? You just, you drill holes, you pop rib nuts in, whatever, and you don't really think about what that means for the long term. But for a rally car, every single hole into the cabin is an ingress route for dust and dirt. And especially on a very dusty stage, you would not believe how much dust can get in through a 1/4 inch drilled hole. So I've spent a lot of time going back and undoing or patching up some of those early holes that I put in the car, or covering them with like aluminum tape or aircraft tape or something like that. So anywhere you're putting this underbody protection on, or anywhere you're working like on the firewall, the rear of the car, around the rear wheel wells, etc. If maybe you're routing brake line through in the trunk area to the rear wheel wells even, be cognizant of the openings you're creating into the cabin and do as little as possible for that. And when you do have to make those pierces through these bulkheads, use grommets, use tape, use rubber, use anything you can to plug as much of that as possible. And that's going to save you so much headache with cleaning and dealing with dirt and water ingress down the road. All right, kind of controversial one here, but one of my don'ts is don't use poly engine mounts or transmission mounts. A lot of people think poly is performance, right? Get rid of that factory rubber as fast as possible and just go to poly mounts. And me personally, I don't think that poly mounts are a good choice for rally applications. You're already introducing so much more shock to the driveline constantly, that making the engine and trans mounts, these rock hard things with no give, I think contribute to early failure with engine and trans components. So I do have aftermarket mounts on this. I have Kind mounts, which are still rubber mounts, but they're like rubber cylindrical, like bullet mounts, and they have a lot less give than the factory, but they've still got that vibration absorption quality that poly will not. It'll just transfer all that shock directly into your drivetrain. And I blew up a transmission on a sharp bump anyway, that transmitted that shock load into the trans and flexed the gear shafts and the drivetrain and instantly blew those gears. And I imagine I probably would have done that even sooner if I had poly mounts for that. So for Subaru specifically, you have Group N mounts that are also kind of like an in-between point between like full-on aftermarket poly mounts, which are great for track, and the OEM rubber mounts, which will probably tear pretty quickly. So I would recommend Group N mounts or Kind mounts specifically for this application, and investigating a little if you have another application. All right, another don't. don't remove or cut away your factory fender liners or covers if at all possible. So all this factory plastic here, this is very hard to reproduce if I was going to try to make covers for this, you know, especially for the fender well covers that are all contoured and such. And what I've done instead is keep all this, right? Because that keeps dust and debris and mud and muck out of areas that are extremely difficult to clean or access. And I've additionally mounted a lot of these with like riv nuts instead of plastic pops. And I am still on the factory original fender liners and covers from when I first built this car 35 events ago. And yeah, some of them have some zip tie stitches, but I have never ejected a fender liner or cover piece on stage. And it's saved me quite a bit of power washing and cleaning on the underside of this car. All right, last two don'ts are going to be involving the brakes. The first thing is, if you have a choice, don't use aluminum calipers. This is perhaps another controversial thing, because if you're looking for performance and lightweight, of course, you know, you step up to aluminum calipers. But as a hobbyist, an amateur without a lot of money, I'm sticking with steel. So why am I doing that? I'm doing that because steel doesn't wear nearly as easily as you get gravel and dirt and such into the barrel of the wheel, and it gets in between the caliper and the barrel. So I've seen quite a few failures of aluminum calipers where you're wearing right through the caliper very, very quickly, and it wears through until it hits a fluid passage or some other critical failure. It detaches from the caliper bracket, or it weakens, or something like that. And you know, if you have aluminum calipers, I just see this long string of other things you have to do, right? You have to have really good wheel scrapers. You have to be checking things regularly. You have to be ready to replace the aluminum caliper very quickly at service, and also replace them at much more frequent intervals overall than a steel caliper. And it's just a lot of sunk cost to me. So I don't recommend that kind of thing if you have a choice. I am still using, 35 events later, for this Subaru, 2 pots in the front and 1 pot in the rear. So stock like 98 to 01 RS brakes. I haven't done the common 4.2 swap. I just have HP Plus pads, and I have braided steel lines, and I have super high temp brake fluid. And I am such a believer in that overall setup for brakes versus just shelling out huge bucks for a big brake setup. I mean, the last event, we ran a 75 speed factor in this car with 2 pot, 1 pots. So if somebody tells you you need bigger brakes, you need better brakes, it's just, I don't believe that. Certainly not for a hobbyist, and certainly not when you first enter the sport. You'll know when you need to step up to bigger brakes if you're out braking them and boiling the fluid or having trouble. But certainly as a first step, that money can go to so many other things that are going to get you more stage time. The last don't, maybe also a controversial one, is don't remove your factory e-brake hardware. So I have had the same e-brake hardware on this since 2019. So I have a working cable operated mechanical e-brake. So this is a drum inside of disc setup on this Subaru. And so for tech purposes, you have to have a latching handbrake, right? You have to have a regular e-brake, or what other people do is they put a pin or something on their hydraulic handbrake so that they can pull it back and insert the pin and have something to hold the car. But of course, if you do that with a hydraulic handbrake, you have no mechanical backup if a line were to fail or something. And certainly on a car where cut brake lines are a pretty common occurrence in rally, I wouldn't want my only means of holding this thing on a hill if I walk away from it or something to be part of the hydraulic system, and I wouldn't want just a hydraulic system and no backup if I had the choice to just leave the mechanical setup in place. So it's not a lot of money, it's probably already working. There's just no reason to cut and remove that hardware if you spend a couple of minutes to make sure it's in good shape and adjusted correctly before you put it back together. And I've never had a problem with this. So certainly also though, if you lose the knuckle, right? If you have to replace a knuckle on the fly, if something bad happens, it's damaged, the wheel bearing is all screwed up, you know, I'm fully prepared to snip this cable and throw a new knuckle on and figure out the mechanical break later. But you have that option, right? It's a very quick call to cut that cable and just throw a new knuckle on without this brake setup and figure out how to get that functional again later. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you found something helpful in all of that combined experience and those suggestions. You know, certainly if you've got tips or tricks or hard-won lessons over the years, post them in the comments. I'd love to hear them. I'm always learning from people and competitors when I go to events, and I talk about what they're doing to make sure that we can all stay on stage and get more miles under our belt. And so this video was pretty much exclusively focused again on externals, you know, suspension, underbody, things like that. And I'll do another video again soon about kind of what we've learned with engine bay prep over these last 5 years, and also with electrical and interior as well. So hope you enjoyed. Take care.